I moved to a small, quiet town. There's a rule nobody is allowed to talk about. I live in a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest. I moved here a year ago to take over a small art gallery that had been a staple in the town for decades. The previous owner, Grace, practically begged me to take it over. She was shaking so violently when she handed me the keys that I thought she might collapse right there. She couldn't look me in the eyes and kept glancing around, like she was afraid someone, or something, was watching. Should have been my first sign, but when you've been living in a cramped apartment and getting by on freelance design work, landing a deal like this felt like fate. The gallery barely stays afloat, but it came with a small cottage behind the building. The place is cozy if a bit run down. The floors creak, the plumbing is temperamental, and the roof leaks when it rains, but it's warm, private, and I have a great view of the mountains. At first, it seemed like I'd found my dream life in a picturesque town straight out of a travel brochure. The streets are lined with wooden cabins and tall spruce trees. Everyone waves hello, but no one asks too many questions. The town square has a weekly farmer's market, and the local cafe serves the best pastries, which everyone swears by. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but they don't judge you for keeping to yourself. On my first morning here, I was arranging a new collection in the gallery when Mayor Lockhart stopped by. He's an older man with a weathered face, a gruff voice, and a walk like he's carrying a heavy load. He told me that he'd give me a tour of the town, but instead he just pointed out the usual spots: the diner, the library, the church. Before he left, he leaned in, his expression serious. "Listen," he said, tapping his fingers on the counter. "There's something you might notice around here, these odd symbols on your door. If you see one, don't ignore it. Tell me right away, no matter what." I gave him a confused look, half smiling. "Why? Who's doing this?" Lockhart waved a hand dismissively. "Doesn't matter who. Just do what I said. It's for your own good." Then, he was gone. I assumed it was some quirky town tradition, maybe a prank. But early the next morning, I saw the mayor walking down the street, inspecting every door. He was methodical, his flashlight scanning the wooden surfaces like he was looking for something specific. When he noticed me watching from my window, he gave a curt nod and continued on his way. He does this every morning, rain, snow, or sun. Months went by, and I settled into the rhythm of the gallery, meeting regulars who came in to browse. One customer, Diane, spent hours picking through the art books, speaking reverently about classic painters like Van Gogh and Monet. "You've got a good eye," she told me one afternoon. "Most newcomers, they don't get it. They think it's just about selling the pieces." I laughed nervously. "Like the woman who used to own this place?" Diane's face went pale, her hand shaking as she set down a sketchbook. "Grace was special. You wouldn't understand unless you'd been here long enough." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened to her?" Diane swallowed hard. "She left, just like everyone does. It's better for them that way." One evening I was cleaning up when I noticed a group of townsfolk walking down the road. The men had their heads down, hands gripping garden tools and baseball bats. The women clutched scarves around their necks, their eyes glazed. At the front of the group was old Charlie Simmons, holding a rifle like it was an old friend. They stopped at the cabin of the new family that had moved in a few weeks earlier, the Petersons. The man, a wiry fellow named Jonah, was dragged out by his neighbors, his wife shouting for help as they pulled him into the street. I watched from the window, my heart racing. They didn't fight back. Jonah just shook his head, muttering to himself, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. They tied him to the back of a truck and drove off, leaving his wife behind. I didn't hear anything more about it until the next morning, when I walked by their cabin. The door was wide open, a fresh layer of paint still dripping down the frame. And there, carved into the wood, was a symbol. A triangle within a circle with lines radiating out like rays of light. I took a photo, but when I tried to search for it online, all I found were pages and pages of unhelpful links about ancient geometry and meaningless symbols. No answers. It wasn't the first odd thing I'd noticed in this town. I figured it was just some local superstition. Nothing to worry about. Life went on. I focused on the gallery and met more locals, all of them oddly reticent about certain topics. But there was one thing they all agreed on. If you saw those symbols, you had to leave. 2 months later, I noticed the parade of footsteps again. This time, It was the elderly couple who ran the bakery for decades. The townspeople had always praised their homemade bread, and no one could remember a time when they weren't around. They weren't fighting it. They were peaceful, accepting, almost like they were relieved. They hugged their neighbors as they packed their belongings into the back of a truck, saying their goodbyes with smiles on their faces. I checked the door the next morning. The symbol was there again. The same triangle within a circle. This time, I asked around. The whispers were there too. If your door was marked with the symbol, you had to go. It was for everyone's safety, though no one would explain why. It seemed like an old, unspoken rule. I was confused, but it was too late. The following evening, a frantic knock came at my door. I opened it, expecting to find a late-night shopper, but instead, it was Diane. She looked pale, her face tight with fear. "You need to listen to me," she said, breathless. "Do not go outside tonight. Stay inside. Lock everything up. Do not respond to anyone, not even if it's me." I didn't have time to ask her why. She was already gone, running into the night. Her words echoed in my mind as I locked up the gallery, wondering what kind of madness I had walked into. The hours crawled by. I sat in my cottage staring at the door, watching the clock tick past midnight. And then, at exactly 12:07 a.m., the knock came. It was soft, gentle, but I didn't answer it. The second knock was louder, more insistent. Someone was desperate. Then came the voice, Diane's voice, but there was something wrong. "Please, let me in. I've been stuck out here. I couldn't make it home in time." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was her voice, but it wasn't. I ran to the back of the house and hid in the closet. The knocking grew louder, frantic, the voice becoming more frantic, pleading, calling out my name. Then, a whisper from the shadows. "You shouldn't have responded." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. I heard nothing but the frantic thumping in my chest. The knocking continued. All night. Different voices. People I knew. People who had left town. In the morning, the town was different. The usual bustle was replaced by a grim silence. I heard the familiar footsteps outside, but this time, they led to the Petersons' house. Their door was off its hinges, splinters scattered on the porch. Blood stained the welcome mat, and the smell of decay hung in the air. I saw Diane in the crowd. She was as pale as the others. Her eyes met mine and she whispered, "They didn't follow the rules." The sheriff, Mayor Lockhart, and the others were there trying to contain the chaos. The Petersons' bodies were being carried away. "Is it over?" I asked Diane. She shook her head. "It's never over, not unless you follow the rules." I stood there, my heart pounding. I couldn't breathe. And then I saw it, carved into my cottage door, as clear as day. The symbol. The triangle within the circle. It's too late now. The rules are the only thing that keeps us alive. My brother is back, but something is definitely not right with him. It started when my brother Adam suggested a week-long camping trip along the Missouri River. He knew I'd been struggling, and getting away from everything seemed like the perfect escape. We'd grown up fishing, hiking, and canoeing together, and between us we had all the latest high-end gear. The idea of spending a week under the stars, catching fish, and breathing in the crisp autumn air sounded perfect. We left early on a Sunday morning, driving deep into the woods where the roads turned to dirt and the trees swallowed the sky. The world out here felt different, older, untouched. The river ran black and slow, coiling through the landscape like a sleeping beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and distant rain. After scouting for a while, we found the perfect spot. A sandbar tucked against a bend in the river, far from any roads or trails. We set up camp, pitched our tent near the tree line, and got a fire going. The first few days were perfect. We fished, drank whiskey by the fire, and talked about everything and nothing. It felt like old times, like when we were kids. But then, on the third night, everything changed. The wind picked up, rustling the trees with an unnatural force. It had been cool before, but now it was cold, bone-deep and biting, far colder than the forecast had predicted. I noticed Adam acting strange. He kept shifting in his seat, drumming his fingers against his knee, glancing over his shoulder like he was waiting for something. "You good?" I asked. He didn't look at me. I keep hearing something. I listened. All I heard was the wind and the slow whisper of the river. It's just the woods, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. He shook his head. Number, it's coming from the water. I turned to look. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement. Something dark just beneath the surface, slipping past our camp like an eel. But when I blinked, it was gone. I brushed it off, but Adam didn't. He barely spoke the rest of the night, constantly checking over his shoulder. Then, just before dawn, I woke to the sound of water splashing. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the campsite. The river was a black moving void, and Adam was gone. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my breath clouding in the freezing air. My bare feet hit the cold sand as I ran toward the riverbank. Adam was standing waist-deep in the water, facing away from me. Adam? My voice came out hoarse. He didn't move. The water around him swirled. The current lapped against his torso, but he wasn't shivering. The air was freezing, but he stood there like the cold didn't touch him. I stepped closer. Come on, man, get out of there. I have to go, he murmured. His voice didn't sound right. It was distant, hollow, like it wasn't really coming from him. A new noise rose above the wind, a deep, gurgling exhale like something massive was breathing just below the surface. Adam stiffened, and then, in an instant, the river pulled him under. I ran, plunging into the freezing water, my arms slicing through the darkness as I searched for him. My fingers brushed something, a leg, but before I could grab it, it was yanked away. The current carried him downstream, vanishing into the blackness. For hours I searched, screaming his name, begging the river to give him back. But by morning, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken reeds, just silence. The authorities searched, but they never found his body. The official story was that he drowned, that the current took him. But I knew something else had taken him. I spent a year trying to convince myself it wasn't my fault, that he was truly gone. And then, last night, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Adam standing there. He wore the same waterlogged clothes from that night, still damp. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes sunken and dark. His jacket caved inward at the chest, like something had crushed it from the inside. He smiled, lips stretching too wide. Hey man, he said. Long time no see. Want to go camping? Despite the cold night air, no breath left his mouth. The days that followed. At first, I convinced myself it was a hallucination, a grief-induced mirage. But when I didn't answer, he knocked again, and again, and again. I shut the door and locked it, but he never left. For hours, I could hear him outside, pacing, knocking, whispering my name. The next morning, I found wet footprints on my porch. He came back the following night. This time, he didn't knock. I woke up to the sound of water dripping in my room. At first, I thought it was a pipe leak, until I saw the puddle spreading across my bedroom floor, and the footprints leading straight to my bed. I grabbed a baseball bat and flipped on the light. There was nothing there, but the air smelled of river water and rotting leaves. I stopped sleeping after that. The third night, I heard him whispering through the walls. The words were muffled, like they were drifting up from beneath the floorboards. But I understood one thing. Come back to the river. I moved out that night, but no matter where I go, he finds me. He doesn't always knock. Sometimes I hear dripping water in the middle of the night. Sometimes I see wet footprints on my floor. Sometimes I wake up gasping for air, my lungs burning like I've been drowning in my sleep. I don't know what came back from that river, but I know it isn't my brother. My friend's final warning. Daniel had always been deeply religious, growing up in a strict household that revolved around faith. From an early age, he immersed himself in scripture, dedicating his life to understanding the deeper meanings of religious texts. In high school, he constantly invited me to church, Bible studies, and long theological discussions. His passion carried over into college, where he pursued a degree in theology, eventually working toward a master's in religious history. But what fascinated Daniel most wasn't just faith or moral teachings. It was the origins of religious stories, the forgotten and hidden truths buried beneath centuries of doctrine. At some point, He became obsessed with the Book of Enoch. That's when he changed. He spoke incessantly about fallen angels, ancient civilizations, and forbidden knowledge. He filled notebooks with strange symbols and erratic diagrams. He studied maps of places like Mesopotamia, Mount Ararat, and the ruins of forgotten cities, convinced that biblical stories weren't just allegories, but actual historical records. His apartment turned into a chaotic archive of ancient texts, papers, and pinned-up maps. He barely slept, barely ate, and his eyes carried a haunted, frantic look. It was as if he had uncovered something no one else was meant to know. We stayed close until after college when he told me that he felt called to travel overseas. He was vague about his destination, only saying he was joining an expedition. Then he vanished. 7 years passed without a single letter, call, or email. Until yesterday. I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was empty, and the message contained only 2 words: "Stay away." Attached was a folder of images. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The first few pictures seemed normal. Daniel, now looking older and more rugged, stood in the desert alongside a group of 6 people, 4 men, 2 women. They were smiling, posing near ruins, sitting by a fire. The images painted a picture of an adventure, a close-knit team exploring history. Then the images shifted. One photo showed the entrance to a cave, carved into the side of a mountain. Another depicted the group venturing inside, their flashlights illuminating strange carvings on the walls. The symbols were unlike anything I had seen before, jagged, ancient, almost moving in the light. The deeper they went, the darker the images became. One showed a vast underground chamber, the team standing frozen, all facing the same direction. The next image was blurrier, as if someone had taken it in a rush. It captured one of the women in mid-air, but she wasn't jumping. She was too high, suspended in the darkness. Then came the carnage. A man was crushed beneath a massive slab of stone, his legs the only thing visible. Another lay sprawled, his torso severed at the waist. Blood pooled across the cave floor. A woman's body was crumpled, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles like a discarded marionette. Their faces were frozen in terror. The second-to-last image made my breath catch. Daniel was crouched behind a large rock, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes wide with terror. Across from him, another survivor lay on the ground, his hands outstretched, palms up, begging for mercy. The final image revealed why. A monstrous leg, thick with coarse hair, stood in the foreground. Its massive foot was human-like but grotesquely large, its nails long and yellowed. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a single massive finger, longer than a grown man, reaching toward Daniel. I closed the file, my hands shaking. I looked once more at his final message. "Stay away." An experimental therapy session promised to change my life. It did, but not how I expected. The opportunity came to me on a rainy afternoon while I was watching a documentary about recovering addicts. I received a pamphlet in my mail that advertised a free week-long therapy session described as innovative and eye-opening, completing with a promise that someone will be returning home feeling a new joy in each aspect of life, as if reborn, whatever that meant. I've been struggling for a long time, and my own therapist had raised his prices far too much for my financial status. A large corner of the paper was dedicated to the head of this event, a middle-aged brunette woman named Dr. Madison, and centered at the bottom were a phone number and email. Looking her and the project up online proved it was in fact real, and that she was a rising figure in her occupation, praised for her unique approach to therapy methods. There were text boxes to fill with the usual personal information and why you were signing up. With nothing to lose, an hour later, I had submitted my application for the project and got a response 2 days later confirming I had been approved and was told the time, date, and location and was instructed to pack some clothes as the entire session would take place in a large room furnished like an apartment. But in reality, we were in a tall corporate building and would be supervised everywhere but the bathrooms. If nothing else, this made me feel safer about having to live with total strangers for a week. I arrived by bus at the building, which was a 5-minute walk from the stop I got off at, where 4 others were already gathered in a circle having a lively chat, all of them neatly dressed, and I instantly recognized Dr. Madison, dressed in a gray suit with hair reaching her shoulders, the other three I assumed being my soon-to-be roommates. A young and beautiful girl with short dark hair, dressed considerably more casual than the rest of them. An older woman with visible wrinkles across her face and gray hair tied in a bun, and a rather tall, well-built man whose face muscles seemed to have forgotten how to smile. When I approached them and introduced myself, Doctor Madison welcomed me and gave me a few moments to meet the other participants of the session. The young girl was named Maria, and she gave me a shy smile as I shook her hand. The old lady was much quieter and reserved and only spoke that her name was Amanda, and the man named Ajay already looked like he did not like me. I already made a mental note that all of us obviously had a reason to be here, except for Maria, whose cheery demeanor was not what I expected to see in anyone signing up for experimental therapy. Dr. Madison walked in front of us and ran over the superficial details of the project once more, asking each of us to confirm our participation just as a formality, which I thought was obvious considering we'd already gone far enough as to show up. We entered an elevator that brought us up to the 4th floor, and she showed us to our apartment, which was actually a surprisingly wide room turned into a 4-room apartment with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living room with the kitchen at the other end. It was surprisingly well furnished, and each of us thanked her for having us. After exchanging those pleasantries, she told us more about the session. Amanda and Maria, you will be sharing that bedroom, and Ajay and Carlos the other one. You have unlimited access to television, books, music, and whatever else you see in this room. You'll be given food 3 times a day, but do not hesitate to press this button by the door to call for us should you need anything else. Every 2 days, the 5 of us will be holding an evaluation, and by then we expect you to have already gotten to know each other enough to share details about your personal lives, be they small or significant. We hope that you enjoy your stay, and I'm very excited to be seeing you soon. Half an hour later, each of us had unpacked and made themselves comfortable in their respective bedrooms. I have to admit that Ajay was not one to talk much, and when he did, I could almost feel how irritated he was that I was trying to get him into a conversation. But in the end, those were Dr. Madison's instructions, and that's why all of us were here. If he didn't want to make an effort, I wasn't going to force him and was just going to turn to Maria or Amanda. Our first proper conversation was during lunch. The staff team brought various meals with and without meat, and careful to make sure that a variety of options was present for any potential allergies. It was impressive to say the least. I thought about how expensive all of this must have been for them, and what they had to get from offering it for free, but it was experimental, I guess. Everyone opened with sharing what they do for work. Maria was a waitress in one of the bigger restaurants in the city, a job she started so she could pay her tuition at university, though she didn't mention what she was studying. Amanda, though retired, ran a large charity I'd heard of, the aim of which was to help the disabled, and Ajay was a police officer. A real shocker, that one. I was the last to speak, telling them I work as a nurse in the private hospital at the edge of town. While we were at the table, I made a few mental notes about each of the 3, like how Maria would always smile and look away when I spoke to her, how AJ was listening more than talking, and how Amanda's hands trembled while trying to bring the spoonful of soup to her mouth. I was worried what they might have seen of me already, and how bad it might just get in the coming days. That evening, the 4 of us collectively decided to enjoy some snacks after dinner in front of the TV and watch a game show. After about an hour, Amanda had gone to bed saying she was exhausted and needed rest, while AJ matter-of-factly stated that he was bored and secluded himself in our bedroom with a book he'd brought himself, leaving me and Maria alone on the couch. Though having met only a few hours ago, I was enamored by her beauty and character, and we must have spent at least an hour and a half getting to know each other before she fell asleep on my shoulder. Her presence calmed me and helped me forget the real reason I was here, if only for mere moments. Maria's family never had a lot of money, and she was mostly providing for herself now, leaving her parents to care for her twin little brothers 2 hours worth of a drive away from here, and that before getting the job she had now, she was working 2 other jobs at the same time. I was happy to hear that she was starting to do better for herself. Not wanting to wake her, I leaned my head back on the couch and was fast asleep soon enough. The second day was rather uneventful, but that's not to say it wasn't going well. I noticed everyone was in a better mood than yesterday, and they were actually talking to each other, sometimes even laughing. I even had the pleasure of being asked a few questions by Ajay, who himself shared that his reason for being here was a scene he'd reported to a while back that left him thinking if he should hand the badge in and find work elsewhere. He didn't elaborate, though, and I decided it was not my place to push him. As for Amanda, I saw her take out a handbag full of medicine, which had my heart drop for a second before she explained that she had to take them at various times of the day for her cancer treatment. She was surprisingly open about it, but still out of respect, I stopped asking questions after that. The meals that second day were much more enjoyable, and we seemed to start finding common ground together despite the age variety, Maria being almost 45 years younger than Amanda. We all stayed up a little later that evening and played a board game accompanied by a glass of wine for each of us, but Amanda, who was adamant we don't pour it away lest we deem her the party killer. Again, after the game ended, only Maria and I remained in the living room, but I was too distracted by what I'd been trying to keep to myself since lunch earlier, and it was that my withdrawal symptoms were beginning to occur. I excused myself and quickly ran off to the bathroom, and then straight to bed, leaving Maria confused and alone in the living room. The third day began with breakfast, and immediately after it, our first evaluation from Dr. Madison. She was dressed elegantly, and accompanying her were two men who wouldn't speak and stood beside her on each side as she sat in front of us with a serious look, quite unlike her from what we had seen so far. "Good morning. From what we've seen so far, you've gotten comfortable with each other. That's good. Some of you have began sharing more personal aspects of your lives, and others have been growing close, have you not?" She threw a glance towards me and Maria, who was sitting to my right, and then continued. "Now it's time for the real treatment to begin. Amanda, why don't you tell everyone here why you signed up for our session?" All eyes darted to Amanda, who lifted her eyebrows in surprise and cleared her throat. "Well, as I've told them and you already, I'd love to have some support and advise while I am going through my cancer treatment. It can be a lot to deal with for someone on their own." "Indeed, it can be. And have you shared with them that most of the money you make from your organization is actually not used to aid the disabled, but in fact goes for your medicine and other treatments?" Maria gasped while AJ threw Amanda a dirty look and shook his head. I was shocked too, of course, but I could understand it, to an extent. But why was Madison being so upfront and hostile about this? "So you use the money people send you to help those in desperate need to help yourself? They're people just as much as you are." I was taken aback by Maria's sudden blow towards Amanda, and she looked at her with an open jaw and hand to her chest as if pleading innocence, but was interrupted by Madison. Now, Maria, people go to great lengths when they are desperate. And while what Amanda is doing is not right from your point of view, I am sure she can explain it sensibly. Like how you can explain manipulating your customers into leaving you more money, I assume." Her words seemed to pierce Maria's chest, and she was defeated. "I thought you'd keep our reasons to yourself," she shouted at her. "Yes, none of this will ever leave my mouth to anyone not involved in our project," were my exact words. "Confidentiality is a given between us and our patients, which all four of you are. Think about it as a version of exposure therapy. Like I said, facing your fears and regrets is one of the first steps to overcoming them, just like you with your opioid addiction, Carlos." My newborn fear had almost instantly come to be as Madison revealed in front of everyone in the room my biggest secret, and I was met with repulsed glances from Amanda, Maria, and Ajay. I had nothing to say and lowered my head. "Is that why you've been pacing around and shaking like a damn junkie, Carlos? You're sick, man." Ajay joined in, verbalizing what I assumed to be the thoughts of everyone else. I didn't find the courage to defend myself, because the word he used was exactly how I'd feared I would be perceived. "Aggression is not an effective way to deal with any type of trauma, AJ. The last time you resorted to it, the man you were supposed to save died before the ambulance could arrive. Remember?" Before Madison could even finish talking, Ajay shot up and sent the chair back, slamming his hands on the table on his way up. "You don't know what you're talking about, you bitch. Get me the hell out of this place right now. I'm done." He started making his way to the door and was interrupted by one of the men who placed a hand on his chest and pushed him back. "I'm afraid I can't let you or anyone else leave, AJ. You've agreed to staying the entire course of the session, and you have 4 days left to go. 5, if you include today." As Ajay tried to push the man away and leave the room himself, he was immediately apprehended by him and thrown into the table, pushing it away and falling on the floor, all three of us jumping back and gasping in response. "You can't do this, woman. Let us out now," Amanda ordered in, as demanding of a tone as her voice could bring itself to, but she was met with the same condescending retort from Dr. Madison, who stood up and brought the chair she was sitting on back under the table. During this time, my eyes trailed to the other man still by her side, who'd put a hand behind his back and was looking towards AJ's direction. "Like I said, you've agreed to participate until the end of our session. I simply cannot let you leave, even more so when you take into consideration that the results from it will help us learn more about our psychological nature." "So this is just some damn experiment, isn't it? Not even a smudge of therapy to be found here, is that it? We're just your little lab rats?" I was livid and wanted out as much as the rest of them did, if not more. You may find this very therapeutic in the end, Carlos, if you reach the end. Had she just said if? Before I could pressure her further on what she meant, the entire room, including Dr. Madison, was shocked when AJ grabbed the man who tackled him and threw him onto the ground when he knelt down to help him back up, punching him and pinning his neck to the floor with his elbow. He seemed to be applying pressure because instantly after the guard began kicking wildly and trying to free himself of his hold. You don't get to decide shit, Madison. I instinctively pushed Amanda and Maria behind me, who were each yelling words I couldn't make out through the rush of adrenaline that had swept over me like a wave. Get us out of here unless... A loud shot rung out and forced everyone on their knees. AJ let out a pained yell and dropped on the floor, the guard he'd kept down taking several deep breaths before getting up and kicking the policeman in the ribs, causing another yelp and making him curl up into a ball even further. I looked towards Madison and the other man who was still keeping his pistol aimed at the injured AJ. She cleared her throat and readjusted herself, pulling on her coat. Acts like these are only going to get you into legal trouble at the end of the session. Don't waste your breaths threatening with lawyers or whatever else you think of. Everything here is government approved. Her gaze turned to the three of us. Your friend will be checked by medical professionals before we bring him back to you, assuming he doesn't cause any more trouble. Ajay was forcefully lifted up by Madison's other guard and basically thrown outside the room, followed by the other two as she spoke once more before the door shut, leaving three terrified people of what might come next. The frightening is haunting my family. We moved in because there was nowhere else to go. The hostel was worse. Mold-eaten walls, a kitchen flooded last spring, rats in the halls. This place? Not perfect. It smelled like damp and something I couldn't quite name, but at least it didn't reek of piss when I walked in. I called that a win. Angie called it a shithole, her eyes rolling back like she was about to laugh or cry depending on the mood. Still, we clinked cans of lager that first night and told the kids to shut it when they started whining about no Wi-Fi. That was 3 weeks ago. The smell of damp still lingers, but I've gotten used to it. Angie hasn't. She's sick of it. Sick of the peeling wallpaper, the way the sink keeps dripping no matter how much she twists the tap. She tells me this between drags of her cigarette, leaning against the kitchen windowsill, smoke curling up and out like it's desperate to get away. My wife's the kind of woman whose laugh could break glass when she means it, but it's been a long while since anyone's heard it. These days, it's more of a low chuckle when she's on her 5th can of lager, something bitter curled up at the edges. Me? I've got this tightening in my chest, an ache somewhere beneath the bone, like something's trying to crawl out, or maybe in. The temper comes easy now, one that embarrasses me in front of the kids, but I never let it go far enough to cause real damage. I keep telling myself that I'm a good dad, even when the mirror says otherwise, haunted eyes staring back, a reminder of too many sleepless nights spent listening to the dark breathe in this new home. Tommy, my youngest, had a look on his face like he'd just eaten a bug the first night here. The boy doesn't say much. 11 years old, but already too serious. He takes after me, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Kids should be laughing, kicking a ball down the estate, but Tommy spends most of his time hunched over the floor scribbling on scraps of paper. I don't like what he draws. I've caught glimpses, long shadows, stick figures with round heads and blacked-out eyes. Something's been eating at the boy. I don't know if it's this place or if it started before we moved in, before the crash, before I fucked everything up. When I asked him what he was drawing, he didn't look up. The frightening, he said. You mean something's frightening you? I corrected him, forcing a small laugh. It's frightening, not the frightening. Tommy looked at me then, his face pale, eyes wide. No, Dad. That's its name. I shrugged it off, looked away, and said to myself it was nothing. But nothing doesn't make the hairs on my neck stand up. Not like those drawings do. Then there's Casey, my daughter. 15, and angry as a cat in a cage with a look that cuts through anyone in the room. She's got Angie's fire, my scowl, and the trouble that comes with both. She's been caught smoking in school and skipping class. I know it's to get away. From here, from me, maybe Angie too. I want to be angry, but I remember what it was like at that age. I did worse. She's got a mouth on her. I've heard her slamming doors and shouting on the phone to one of her mates, her voice echoing through the narrow hall only for Angie to yell back, "Shut the fuck up!" There's a hole in the wall from where Casey kicked it, right through the plaster. I still haven't patched it up. What's the point? Another hole will take its place soon enough. Anger has a way of finding new places to leave a mark. It was just meant to be a place. A council flat on a council estate. One of 100 just like it. Nothing special, nothing worth looking at twice. But there's something about this one. I felt it when I was sitting on the battered couch in the living room. Angie beside me, both of us half drunk on cheap lager. The kids were asleep. I was staring into the blank TV screen and saw it. Just for a second. A flicker in the dark. Something behind me, a shape that moved just before I turned around. I didn't tell Angie. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. She was too busy complaining about our new neighbors, something about how Mrs. Caldwell across the corridor had kept staring at her like she had a problem. "Old cow's probably deaf, but she's got eyes like a bloody hawk," Angie had said while crushing a cigarette into the ashtray. I laughed just to humor her and watched the reflection in the TV until I couldn't see anything except my own face staring back. Angie's been on edge since the day we moved in. She says it's the estate. It's full of freaks and fuck-ups. She's not wrong. I see them every time I step outside. The lads on the corner, hoods pulled up and passing spliffs back and forth, their eyes following me as I walk past. Mrs. Caldwell's curtains twitching when I open the front door. I've heard her muttering to herself about the new lot. Said it like she was expecting something, like she knew. "She's fucking mad," Angie said, stubbing out her cigarette and lighting another one. "If she keeps staring at me, I'm gonna give the bitch something to stare at." There was a bite to her voice, something sharp that I didn't like. I told her to leave it, but she just looked at me. "You don't get it, do you?" And I didn't answer because she's right. I don't. It's not much better now. The flat still doesn't feel like mine. The kitchen lights decided to flicker every time I walk in, vibrating with a harsh buzzing that makes my teeth grind together. I told Tommy not to worry about it. "It's just old wiring, son." But the boy wouldn't stop staring. I've tried changing the bulb, but it didn't help. Now it's just another thing I ignore along with the peeling wallpaper, the dripping tap, the hole in the plaster, and the cold draft that slips through every nook and cranny. And then there's the noises. I hear them at night when everyone else is asleep. Angie's breathing heavy beside me, and I'm awake, listening. It's coming from the walls, scratching, soft and slow, like an animal trying to get in. Every time I get up and put an ear to a wall, it stops. I'm starting to think it's only there because I'm listening. Fucking rats again. They've followed me here. But I never see them and tell myself it's just old pipes, the wind, whatever makes old places like this groan and complain when the dark comes. Tommy's been sleeping in mine and Angie's room for the past week. He said there was something wrong with his, said he didn't like it. I asked him why, and he just whispered with his eyes to the floor. "The frightening," he said again. "It's in my room." I tried to press him and tell him not to be daft, but Angie told me to leave it. He's a kid. Kids get scared of their own shadows. So I did. I took his mattress, dragged it to our room, and laid it on the floor beside our bed. He hasn't said much since, but I see the way he looks at the door, like he's waiting for something to come through it. It was last night when it happened. Angie was asleep, Casey out, Tommy curled up on the floor beside me. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a loud knocking. Hard, deliberate, shaking the front door in its frame. "Fucking hell," I muttered, rubbing my face. "What now?" I sat up, glancing at Tommy's mattress. Empty. Typical. "Tommy!" I shouted, dragging myself out of bed. "Where the hell are you?" The knocking came again, louder this time. I stormed down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the floor. The hall felt longer than it should have, but I didn't have time to think about that. The knocking kept going, relentless, like whoever was on the other side wasn't planning to stop. When I reached the door, I saw him. Tommy. Standing there, his little hands fumbling with the lock. "Tommy, what the fuck are you doing?" I snapped, grabbing him by the shoulders. He didn't even flinch. His eyes were wide, glassy, locked on the door. "It's here," he whispered. "The frightening wants to come in." "The what?" I barked, shaking him. "It's the middle of the bloody night, mate. Get back to bed." The knocking stopped. I sighed, running a hand over my face. For fuck's sake, I muttered, unlocking the door. You've got to be kidding me. I yanked the door open, ready to rip into whoever thought it was funny to wake me up. But there was no one there. The corridor stretched out in front of me, empty except for the flickering overhead light casting sickly shadows along the walls. The air felt colder than it should have, biting against my skin like the open door had invited winter inside. Fucking hell, I muttered under my breath, leaning out slightly to peer down the corridor. Nothing. Just the same grimy concrete and paint I'd seen 100 times before. I shook my head, slamming the door shut hard enough to make the frame rattle. Fucking kids, I grumbled, locking the door again. I turned back and froze. Tommy was still standing there, but my eyes were fixed on something behind Tommy, in the shadows that clung to the corners of the flat. My mouth went dry, and for a second I couldn't bring myself to speak. It was there. It was exactly like his drawings. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched too far, bent in ways that didn't make sense. Its face was blank, featureless, and yet I could feel it looking at me. A jagged grin split its featureless head, teeth blackened and broken, stretching far too wide. One long, spindly hand rested on Tommy's shoulder. The nails were sharp, curling like claws that could dig straight through him. Tommy didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still, like he didn't even notice it was there. The thing tilted its head toward me, almost curious, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly frozen. My mind screamed at me to move, to grab Tommy and run, but my body wouldn't listen. I just stood there, staring into that blank, grinning face. And then it leaned down. Its head dipped lower, its mouth moving like it was whispering something into Tommy's ear. I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to hear it. Tommy blinked, slowly, and then turned to look at me. His expression hadn't changed. Calm, distant. "He's not going to leave, Dad," he said softly, his voice steady in a way that turned my stomach. "He's here now." The thing straightened, towering over both of us. Its grin widened, impossibly so, as if it was waiting. For what, I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I finally managed to move, my hand snapping out to grab Tommy's arm and yank him behind me. The thing didn't stop me. It didn't move at all. It just stood there watching, the grin never faltering. I slammed the bedroom door shut behind us, locking it with shaking hands. Angie stirred in the bed, mumbling something incoherent, but I didn't answer. My back pressed against the door as I slid to the floor, holding Tommy close as he stared up at me, calm as ever. "What the fuck was that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Tommy didn't answer. He just rested his head against my chest, his small hand gripping my shirt. "He's not leaving," he repeated quietly. "Not ever." I don't know what the fuck to do. I can't leave this room with that thing out there, but I can't sit here either. Casey's still outside, and if something happens to her... Jesus. Angie won't believe me. Even if she did, what could we do? It's here. It's already in. I'm not the kind of bloke to ask for help. Never have been, but I don't think I've got a choice anymore. I need someone who knows what this is, what the fuck it wants, and how to get rid of it. If you've seen anything like this, if you've heard of something called the frightening, you'd better tell me. I don't care how mad it sounds. I don't care if you think I'm off my nut. Just tell me what the fuck to do before this thing kills us all. My girlfriend talks in her sleep. Last night she told me where the bodies are. If I'm being honest, I ignored the warning signs. I mean, wouldn't you? Sharon was perfect, or at least she seemed perfect at the time. She's beautiful in that classic way that makes people stop and stare. Smart too. She's got a dry sense of humor that could cut glass, and she knows exactly how to use it. We've been dating for 8 months now. And yeah, maybe it was a little fast, but everything just clicked. From our first date, I knew I wanted her in my life. She felt like the total package, someone I could actually see myself building a future with. Looking back, there were little things I should have paid more attention to. It started on our 4th date. We were sitting on her couch drinking wine when she brought it up. "I should probably warn you about something," she said, swirling her glass. I raised an eyebrow, already half in love with her. "Oh? What's that?" "I'm not the easiest person to sleep next to," she said. I laughed, thinking she was making a joke. "Don't worry, I've shared a bed with snorers before. I think I can handle it." She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. It's not just snoring. I talk in my sleep. Sometimes I move around well, I've even been known to slap people by accident. Slap people, huh? Sounds like an occupational hazard, I teased. She gave me this look, half serious, half amused. I'm just saying, it's happened before. If you decide to stick around, you've been warned. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It sounded harmless, even kind of cute. But looking back, yeah, I should have taken her more seriously. The first time I stayed over at her place, I was anticipating a slap in my sleep just so I could poke fun at her about it the next morning. But for the most part, that first night was uneventful. She tossed and turned a little, muttering what sounded like random gibberish. Not the red one, and don't let it fall. I barely noticed. Over the next few weeks, her quirks started to come out more. One night, I woke up to her hand smacking me squarely in the chest. What the hell? I mumbled, groggy and confused. Sharon was still asleep, her arm falling limp against the bed. The next morning, I brought it up over breakfast. So, you hit me last night. She almost choked on her coffee, her eyes wide with mock horror. I did. Yup, full-on smack. Guess you were dreaming about fighting someone. She grinned, shaking her head. Maybe I was dreaming about Aaron. Aaron was her ex-husband. She didn't talk about him much, but from what I gathered, their divorce had been messy. The way she said his name, half joking, half bitter, made me wonder if there was more to the story. Still, I laughed it off. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. The warnings kept coming, however, in subtle ways I didn't recognize for what they were. A few weeks into staying over, Sharon brought it up again one night as we got into bed. I wasn't kidding about the sleep stuff, you know, she said. I know, I replied, pulling the covers over us. Honestly, it's not that bad. It's sort of adorable. Her smile faltered for just a second. Just don't freak out if I say something weird, okay? I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Sharon, it's no trouble, really. I think you're perfect, and nothing you say in your sleep is going to change that. She smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Now I wish I'd taken that moment more seriously. The first few weeks of staying at Sharon's place were normal enough. Sure, she moved a lot in her sleep, tossing, turning, even mumbling, but I figured it was just part of her quirky charm. But then her topics of conversation changed dramatically. At first, she'd say things like, put that down, or get the cat, harmless nonsense, and I'd laugh about it the next morning. But one night, about a month in, I woke up to something different. It's under the oak tree, Sharon murmured, her voice low and steady. I blinked, groggy and confused. Sharon? She didn't respond. Her body was still, her breathing slow and even. I sat up and leaned closer. What's under the oak tree? Nothing. She didn't say anything else, just rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The next morning, over breakfast, I brought it up. You said something weird in your sleep last night, I told her. Sharon raised an eyebrow, sipping her coffee. Oh yeah? What did I say? It was strange. You said, it's under the oak tree. She tilted her head like she was trying to figure out if I was joking. Huh, that's weird. Maybe it was about a treehouse or something. Do you remember what you were dreaming about? She shook her head. Nope, my dreams are unbelievably random. You know how it is. I nodded, but her answer didn't sit right with me. There was something about the way she brushed it off, too casually, like she was trying to steer the conversation in another direction. A week later, I woke up to her pacing, circling the bed as if she was measuring the room. Sharon? I whispered, rubbing my eyes. She didn't answer. I reached for the bedside lamp, but as soon as I touched the switch, she stopped dead in her tracks. Don't, she said sharply. My hand froze. Don't what? She didn't respond. For a moment, she just stood there, then climbed back into bed, her movements stiff and robotic. The next morning, I kept it to myself. I wanted to ask her about what she'd said, but something told me not to. Things got worse after that. One night, she sat straight up in bed and started muttering again. 2 miles from the highway, she said, her voice calm and steady. It works better when the ground is wet. I didn't even try to wake her this time. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When she finally rolled over and went quiet, I got up and went to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water. What the hell was going on? The breaking point came a few nights later. I woke up to Sharon sitting at the edge of the bed, her back to me. "I told you it wouldn't work," she whispered. I sat up slowly. "Sharon?" She didn't turn around. Her head tilted slightly like she was listening to someone I couldn't see. "He said he'd take care of it, but he didn't. Now it's my problem." "Sharon, who are you talking to?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and walked out of the bedroom. I didn't follow her. I just sat there, frozen, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. When I woke up the next morning, she was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. I forced a smile, but my stomach churned. I couldn't stop thinking about the things she'd said in her sleep. The night I realized something was really wrong started like any other. Sharon fell asleep quickly, curled up on her side, while I stayed awake scrolling on my phone. Everything seemed normal until I heard her voice. At first, I thought she was speaking to me. "I held his nose shut," she said. I froze. Her voice was low, cold, almost monotone. It didn't take long. He kicked for a while, but then he stopped. I turned to her. Sharon was still lying on her side, breathing slowly. "Sharon?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Dragged him down the embankment. The soil was soft, perfect for digging." "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I confronted her. "You were talking in your sleep again last night." Sharon glanced up from her coffee, looking amused. "Oh, no, really?" What did I say this time? I hope it wasn't anything embarrassing. I hesitated. You said something about suffocating someone and digging a grave." She frowned. "That's weird. Maybe a nightmare about one of those crime shows I watch. You know how much Netflix I binge." She laughed, but it didn't feel genuine. "You don't remember what you were dreaming about?" I pressed. Sharon shook her head. "No, sorry. Honestly, Chris, I never remember any of my dreams." I nodded, but I suspected she wasn't telling me everything. A few nights later, I woke up to her voice again. "Max," she said. Her tone was calm, detached. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. "He's behind the old barn," she continued. "The one with the blue door." The name was familiar. A young man named Max had gone missing years ago while on a camping trip. His case was still unsolved. The next morning, I didn't bring it up. I didn't know how to. But I couldn't get the name, or her words, out of my head. I Googled Max's name on my phone. His disappearance had happened in the next county over. There was no mention in the reports of a barn or a blue door, but the other details Sharon had mentioned matched the description of the area where he'd last been seen. A few days later, I worked up the courage to suggest something to Sharon. She was grinning when I first approached. "Have you ever thought about doing a sleep study?" I asked carefully. Her smile faded. "Why would I do that, Chris?" "I don't know. Just, you've been saying some really strange things in your sleep. Maybe it's stress or something." "I'm fine," she said, shaking her head. "You're overthinking it." "What about recording it?" I said. "Just so you can hear it for yourself." Her expression darkened instantly. "Number, absolutely not. That's a huge invasion of privacy." "I wasn't trying to. If you ever record me without my permission, Chris, we're done. I mean it." Our eyes met. I nodded, and we went on with our day. Inside, however, my world was unraveling. That night, after she fell asleep, I couldn't help myself. I propped my phone under a pillow on her side of the bed and hit record. The next morning, while Sharon was in the shower, I played back the audio file. At first, it was just static. Then, around 2 a.m., her voice came through, clear as day. "Nina screamed too much," Sharon murmured. "Fast had to move fast. No mistakes." I froze. Nina. I knew her too. A teenager by that name had disappeared 5 years ago, and her case was still open. No, it couldn't be, I thought. This isn't impossible. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know if what she was saying was true. That afternoon, I drove to one of the locations Sharon had described, a barn with a blue door. It wasn't far, about 20 minutes outside of town. I found it easily enough. The building was old and weathered, its door faded to a dull gray. Behind the barn was a small grove of trees. The soil beneath them looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently. I told myself to leave, but I couldn't. I grabbed a nearby stick and started scraping at the dirt. I didn't have to dig for long. The smell, pungent and unmistakable, hit me first. Then I saw it. A torn, dirt-streaked patch of fabric clinging to what I could only describe as remains. I stumbled back. My head swam as I struggled to process what I was looking at. Sharon hadn't been dreaming. I couldn't stop myself. Every night after Sharon fell asleep, I set up my phone to record. And every morning, while she showered or made coffee, I reviewed what she'd said. It was always the same. She kept crying, so I had to do it fast. It wasn't clean, she'd said. She's in the quarry now. The water keeps her hidden. The names changed, but the pattern didn't. Every night, Sharon whispered something chilling, something specific. Beneath the roots, that's the trick, she'd won one night. No one ever checks beneath the roots. Every morning, I woke up more terrified than the last. The audio files piled up, each one a piece of a horrifying puzzle. I couldn't deny it anymore. These weren't dreams, they were confessions. Sharon started to notice something was off. "You've been quiet lately," she said one morning, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the table. "Just tired," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. "You're always tired these days," she said, tilting her head. "Is something bothering you?" "No," I lied. "Nothing." She studied me for a moment, her gaze sharp and unblinking, and then smiled. "Okay." After that, I felt she watched me more closely, just waiting for me to slip up. One night she caught me. I thought she was asleep. I was sitting on the couch, headphones plugged into my phone, listening to the latest recording. "I told him I'd take care of it," Sharon whispered in the recording. "But he didn't listen. I had to clean up his mess." The sound of her voice made my skin crawl. "What are you doing, Chris?" I jumped, yanking the headphones out of my ears. Sharon was standing in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Nothing," I said quickly, locking my phone and shoving it into my pocket. Her eyes narrowed. "Were you just listening to something?" "No," I stammered. "I was just scrolling through Instagram." She didn't move. Her expression didn't change. She just stood there, staring at me. "Let me see your phone," she said finally. "What?" I said, laughing nervously. I said, "Give me your phone, Chris." "Why?" "Because I think you're lying to me." I stood up, trying to keep my voice calm. "Sharon, you're being ridiculous." "Am I?" she said, taking a step closer. "You've been acting weird for weeks, avoiding me, locking your phone. What are you hiding?" "Nothing," I said. "Why would you think I—" "Then let me see it," she said, cutting me off. "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. Sharon's voice was cold and flat. "You recorded me, didn't you?" A wave of dread washed over me. "I don't know what you're talking about." She took another step forward. "While I was sleeping, you recorded me. Admit it." "Sharon, Give me the phone, Chris." "No." She lunged at me, her fingers clawing for my pocket. I stumbled back, trying to push her away, but she was relentless. "Give it to me!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the apartment. I twisted out of her grip and ran for the door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the building. Sharon was standing at the window, watching me. I didn't go back for my things, not even my phone. The next day, I logged into my cloud account from a public library computer. The recordings were gone. Sharon must have found a way to delete them. I sat there staring at the empty folder. All the evidence, every scrap of proof, was gone. I didn't go to the police. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That my girlfriend confessed to a dozen murders in her sleep? That I found a body exactly where she said it would be? They'd laugh me out of the station. Or worse, they'd think I was involved. And without the recordings, I had nothing but my word. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I drove straight to the next town over, checked into a cheap motel, and spent the rest of the night staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. The next morning, I bought a new phone with cash. It was nothing fancy, just a basic model that could make calls and access my cloud account. Not that it mattered. The recordings had vanished. Every file I'd backed up had been erased. She'd found a way to delete them. For weeks, I stayed in the motel, keeping my head down and jumping at every sound outside my door. I just knew Sharon was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I avoided social media, too afraid she would use it to track me down. The only thing I kept up with was the news. Every morning, I scrolled through local crime reports, praying I wouldn't see her name, or worse, hear that another body had been discovered. At first, there was nothing. No missing persons or disappearances, no murders. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe I'd scared her enough to stop. Then, the killings started again. It was small things at first. A man found strangled in his home. A woman's body pulled from a lake. Both in neighboring counties, the circumstances eerily similar to the stories Sharon had whispered in her sleep. I told myself it was just a coincidence. It had to be. But then it got closer. A teenage girl went missing from my hometown. Her bike found abandoned on the side of the road just a mile from where I grew up. A week later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave beneath a grove of trees. I couldn't breathe when I saw the report. The site matched Sharon's description exactly. Beneath the roots, that's the trick. No one ever checks beneath the roots. It was her. It had to be. The breaking point came when the news reported another victim, my cousin, Riley. Riley and I weren't close, not anymore, but we'd grown up together. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into, always smiling and laughing. When I saw her name on the news feed, I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The reporter said she'd been found near the same grove where the teenager's body had been discovered. They didn't give any details, but I already knew what they weren't saying. I knew it was Sharon. For days, I couldn't eat or sleep. All I could think about was Riley, how I could have stopped this if I'd done something sooner. If I'd gone to the police or told anyone about what Sharon had said. But I hadn't. I'd run away like a coward, and now Riley was dead. The guilt was suffocating. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but running away from Sharon has to be the worst. I thought leaving would save me. I thought it would keep her from finding out how much I knew. But the truth is, it didn't save Riley. It didn't save anyone. I can't keep this to myself anymore. I don't care if no one believes me, or if people think I'm crazy. Even if it put a target on my back, I have to tell someone, have to do something. For days, I've sat here trying to find the right words that might make someone believe me, words that might stop her. But the truth is, I don't think it matters anymore. Riley is dead, and it's my fault. I can't stop seeing her face on the news. I can't stop hearing my mom's voice on the phone, shaking as she told me what happened. I could have done something. I could have stopped Sharon. But I didn't. I ran. My hands are shaking, my head is pounding, and my chest feels tight. But I have to get it out. I just need someone to know. Her name is Sharon. She's smart, beautiful, perfect on the outside, and she's a murderer. She's confessed to everything. Max, Nina, all of them. She described how she did it, where she buried them. I thought it was just dreams at first. God, I wanted to believe it was just dreams, but I found one of them. I dug where she said to dig, and there he was. I tried running. I thought if I stayed quiet, she'd let me go. But the killings never stopped. I suppose I want someone to know the truth before she finds me. Because she will. It's just a matter of time. There's a noise. I freeze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I hear the sound of glass breaking, of footsteps, slow and steady, coming from the kitchen. A wave of nausea overwhelms me. I grab the gun from my nightstand, my hands trembling so badly I nearly drop it. Oh God, she's here. I don't know if I'll make it out of this. If I disappear, you'll know why. If anyone finds this, please, don't let her get away with it. Every day at 3:13 p.m., my cat, Theo, perches in the same exact spot, eyes locked on the wall, unblinking, unmoving. He does this for exactly 27 minutes, and lately I've started to think he wants me dead. I'd always wanted a cat. Something to fill the quiet void of my house, a little companion to curl up beside me as I worked long hours from home. But my husband Daniel wasn't on board. They're messy, they claw up furniture, and they make the whole house stink, he grumbled. It took weeks of convincing. Daniel was never the type to see the appeal of pets, but I was persistent, maybe a little too persistent. Eventually, with an exasperated sigh, he caved. Fine, he muttered, but you're the one scooping the litter. Theo was everything I wanted, a sleek black cat with a soft purr and intelligent green eyes. The moment I brought him home from the shelter, he pressed against my shoulder, as if we belonged to each other. But I remember the shelter worker's hesitation before I left. He's been returned 3 times, she said, carefully eyeing me. Some cats need patience. Just be mindful. I brushed it off. Every pet had an adjustment period. But from the very first night, Daniel barely acknowledged Theo. Let's see how long before I regret this, he muttered. And yet, within weeks, Daniel and Theo were inseparable. Theo curled into Daniel's lap during movie nights, purred when he scratched behind his ears. Even Daniel admitted, okay, he's growing on me. That should have made me happy. But by then, I'd already noticed his pattern. Every afternoon, at exactly 3:13 p.m., Theo would stop whatever he was doing, hop onto the couch, and stare at the same section of the wall for 27 minutes. No blinking, no twitching, just absolute unwavering stillness. At precisely 3:40 p.m., he'd stretch, hop down, and rub against my legs like nothing had happened. At first, I laughed it off. Cats were weird. Maybe it was some instinctual quirk. My friends joked, he probably sees a ghost. Then one day I tried to move him mid-stare. A guttural hiss erupted from his throat, his back arched, fur bristling, pupils blown wide. Before I could react, he lashed out, claws raking deep into my arm. Pain bloomed across my skin as I staggered back, blood welling up in jagged red streaks. Theo, still perched on the couch, returned to staring at the wall, like nothing had happened. And then, the accident started. Small things at first. A glass of water slipping from my hand, my laptop crashing to the floor. Then, one evening, as I bit into a protein bar, an overwhelming wave of nausea hit me. The taste, rotten, briny, wrong. Tuna. My stomach churned. I spat it out, heart pounding. It was a chocolate almond bar. There was no reason for it to taste like fish. No reason at all. Across the room, Theo sat in his usual spot, ears twitching slightly, like he was listening. The next day, I worked late, hyper-aware of the time as the afternoon ticked away. At 3:13 p.m., my fingers hovered over my keyboard. 3:16. Theo leapt onto the couch. 3:20. The air grew thick, charged, like the house itself was holding its breath. 3:27. My heart hammered in my chest, and at 3:31 p.m., the ceiling fan groaned. The sound was deep, wrenching, like metal grinding against bone. I looked up just in time to see the screws twisting loose, the entire fan shaking violently. My pulse slammed in my ears as a jagged crack split through the ceiling. A sickening pop. I barely dove away in time. The fan crashed onto my desk, the blades embedding deep into the wood. My monitor shattered, coffee splattering like blood across the floor. I gasped for air, my body shaking, my mind racing. Theo had moved. I turned to check the time, 3:40 p.m. His lips twitched, as if forming a word. No sound, just the shape. Missed again. That night, I showed Daniel the scratches across my arms. "Something is wrong with him," I whispered. "Every day at 3:13, something bad happens." Daniel sighed. "Olivia, come on." He glanced at Theo, curled up in a soft ball by the fireplace. "You're imagining things." "You don't see what I see." "You work from home," he said gently. "Maybe you're just lonely, too focused on him." I needed proof. The next day, I set up my phone, camera trained on Theo. As 3:13 p.m. arrived, I sat at my desk, pretending to work, watching. Then, a faint wisp of smoke curled from the kitchen. Panic shot through me. I hadn't touched the stove. I bolted toward it. The burner was on. A dish towel beside it blackened, curling at the edges, the flames licking toward the curtains. Shit. I yanked the fire extinguisher from under the sink, foam blasting over the flames before they could spread. When I turned back, Theo sat on the couch, his green eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't blink. 3:40 p.m. He stretched, hopped down, rubbed against my leg with a soft purr. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and hit play. The footage loaded, and my stomach dropped. Because on the screen, I wasn't in the kitchen, I was on the couch, sitting in Theo's spot. My hands folded neatly in my lap, my eyes locked onto the wall. Motionless. For exactly 27 minutes. I gasped, my entire body trembling. No, that's not what happened. Daniel took the phone from my shaking hands. "Liv," he said softly, concern deep in his voice. "You're not a cat." I backed away, bile rising in my throat. My mind reeled, but one thing was crystal clear. Theo had to go. That night, I bundled him into his carrier and drove deep into the forest. I didn't breathe until we were miles away. At the clearing, I unlatched the carrier. "Go," I whispered. Theo blinked up at me, stretched, then padded into the trees without looking back. Relief flooded through me. I had done it. I was safe. When I got home, Daniel was on the couch watching TV. He turned with a lazy smile. "Hey, where have you been?" And then I saw him. Theo, curled in Daniel's lap, purring, rubbing against his hand. The blood drained from my face. My vision blurred. Daniel scratched Theo's chin. "I think he missed you." After the accident, I realized I wasn't the one in control. I've lived with the voice for 11 years now. 11 years since I first heard the pained whispers drift up from the back of my mind. 11 years since the accident. I don't remember much from before the wreck, probably about the same amount any person does from their first 7 years of life. But I do recall every detail of the day that everything changed for me. Maybe the trauma of it all seared it into my memories. My mother, Dr. Vivian Graves, was driving me home from soccer practice through the winding, fog-shrouded roads of Black Hollow. Some of her hair was draped over the back of the headrest. I was seated behind her, and when she refused to stop for ice cream, I grabbed a handful of the dark strands and tugged hard. Distracted for a moment by the sudden pain in her scalp and turning to yell at me, she ran a stop sign. I'll never forget the look of terror on the young woman's face in the other car as she was about to T-bone us, nor her screaming expression turning toward the back seat just before the collision. My father, Dr. Marcus Graves, was on the board of the highest-rated hospital in the city, and he ensured that we received the best surgeons and the best treatment. The passengers in the other vehicle, a young mother and her 2 sons, were not so lucky. Still, it was a miracle that I survived. The impact was right behind our car's driver's door, right where I was sitting. I should have been crushed. But I did not emerge completely unscathed from the incident. My body was mangled beyond repair, my face shredded by broken glass and twisted metal, my larynx battered to permanently alter my voice, my eyes damaged such that I was declared legally blind, though losing the majority of my sight was probably for the best, as I was unrecognizable. With extremely powerful glasses, I was able to see just enough of my reflection to recoil in horror the only time that I ever felt brave enough to look into the mirror with them on. My parents found me sobbing in the restroom and calling myself a monster that morning. A few days later, they told me that we were moving away, that they were wanting to avoid me having to return to school and the onslaught of difficult questions or cruel ridicule from the children that knew me before. Clear across the country, we went from west coast to east, leaving everything behind, including all of the photographs of me taken prior to the accident, which, my mother and father explained, they did as a kindness, to avoid any reminders of how I used to look. We were starting a new life, and they seemed intent on addressing the accident and my disfigurement from it as little as possible. In fact, it seemed at times that they wanted to pretend that it never happened. My mother sustained some superficial damage as well, but she became expertly adept at hiding her scars with makeup, and both of my parents refused to elaborate to anyone that inquired about my injuries other than to say we were in a car wreck, that I was a perfectly normal little boy whose physical wounds shouldn't define him, and that they would discuss it no further. Often, I appreciated their attitude, as they worked fiercely to ensure that my childhood was no different than any other, but there were days that I wished they would at least be willing to talk to me about it. Like the night that I first heard the voice. 6 months after the accident, we were settled into our new home in Black Hollow, and I wasn't quite yet adjusted to my surroundings. So, it was not a surprise when I awoke in the pitch black of my room at some point in the middle of the night. Without my glasses, I wasn't able to see the numbers on the clock to tell me exactly what time it was, but the chirp of crickets outside my window and the absolute absence of light told me that it was well beyond my bedtime. And it wouldn't have much mattered if I could see the clock anyway, as I was unable to turn my head to face it. My body was frozen. No matter how much effort I exerted, I couldn't even wiggle a finger. I was petrified. My breaths came rapidly, and I tried to call out for my parents, but my vocal cords refused to vibrate. And then, I heard it. "Who are you?" A childlike whisper grated through my head, a voice simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, originating from somewhere in the depths of my brain. "What?" I replied in thought, still unable to speak aloud. "You shouldn't be here." It sounded just as frightened as I was, trembling, near to tears. Then, without warning, my left arm moved. Absent my command, or me willing it to do so, I felt it raise up off the bed and ball its hand into a fist. Open and closed, open and closed. The fingers curled in and out, as if trying to grasp something in the air. "You shouldn't be here!" The voice screamed at me, and in instinctual self-preservation, I yelled back at it in my mind. "Stop! Leave me alone!" Willing it to go away with every ounce of strength in my tiny body. And my arm fell back to my side. Then suddenly, as quickly as it had come on, my paralysis lifted. Sweating profusely, I threw my covers off and ran for my parents' bedroom as quickly as I could. One small benefit to my new condition was that I could navigate much more easily in the dark than others. Most days, I didn't even bother with my glasses as they gave me a headache, and I got very used to finding my way without the benefit of sight. The route from my room to my mother and father's was already memorized, and I was shaking them awake less than a minute after regaining my mobility. It wasn't easy for me to explain to them what had happened, as they were having to translate the hysterical words I managed to gasp out through fierce hyperventilation. But eventually, they pieced together my story of the voice and how I briefly lost control of my body. I expected that they'd be scared too, that they might even take me to the hospital. Yet I was shocked when they barely reacted. It's not as if they were cold and uncaring. They did comfort me. My mother rubbed my back while my father described sleep paralysis, saying that that was very likely what I'd experienced. And they kept repeating that it was a perfectly normal thing. Even as a young child, I could tell there was something wrong with their logic. Dad noted that sleep paralysis could involve hallucinations, accounting for the voice, and a loss of motor function, accounting for me waking up frozen. However, it didn't elucidate how my arm had moved on its own, or the strange grasping motion it kept repeating. He had no answers for that, other than to tell me that I was okay, that I was safe, that the voice hadn't hurt me, and that the worst part of the experience was only the fear it induced. But he did warn me that it might happen again, and with his warning, he tendered some advice. If the voice comes back and you find that you're not in control anymore, just do exactly what you did tonight, okay? Tell it to go away and that you're in charge, he said. And, with no other guidance or plans on how to deal with it, when it did return again and again, that's exactly what I did. As I grew, I learned to live with it. Neither of my parents were willing to discuss it beyond that first night other than to reiterate my father's instructions, and it only infrequently impacted my existence. By the time I was 12, I had heard it on 9 different occasions, always at night, always awaking me from a deep sleep. The physical manifestations were identical each instance, complete immobility other than my phantom arm grasping at the air. But the phrases it wormed through my mind changed. Not fair, leave, your fault, stolen. However, every time it looped back around to, you shouldn't be here. And though on each intrusion I was able to fend it off by telling it to leave and that I was in control, every occurrence resulted in pure terror for me. No matter how many times my parents repeated that it was sleep paralysis and there was nothing to fear long term, I was still worried that one day it might take over for good. That one day, I would become a passenger in my own body, especially considering that I didn't understand why it was happening. As I mentioned, I didn't have many memories from before the accident, but I was certain that it had never happened before then. I surmised that there must have been something about the wreck that triggered it, and it wasn't until 5 years after it happened that I first heard the term survivor's guilt. My mother was watching a daytime talk show, and they were interviewing guests that had survived traumatic accidents, one of whom described something similar to what I was experiencing. A voice in their head, nagging them for still being alive when others had died. Listening to their story, I found myself empathizing with them. Maybe subconsciously I was punishing myself for causing the accident by distracting my mother. Maybe, "You shouldn't be here," was the voice telling me that I shouldn't be alive when it was my fault that other people weren't. But it wasn't a perfect fit for everything the voice said. What did it mean when it told me to leave, or said, stolen? It was more difficult to view those words through the lens of survivor's guilt. Yet it was the best theory I had, and the one that I carried until I was 15. Until I met my best friend Jasper Kane in freshman homeroom. The first real friend that I made after the wreck. He didn't care how disfigured my face was or that I couldn't see. A bit of an outcast himself, we quickly bonded, and I shared everything about myself with him, including the details of how I received my injuries, and of the whispers in my head. My father had told me, explicitly, that I should never speak about the voice to anyone else. Really, he told me never to speak of it at all, but especially not to mention it outside of our house. However, I trusted Jasper implicitly. He'd told me about his struggles at home, about his mom's drinking, and his dad's neglect. I didn't think it fair to hold back any details of my life from him. So, it was Jasper that gave me my second theory on the origins of the voice, as he didn't agree that it was a simple case of survivor's guilt. He suspected an attachment. Jasper was much more into the world of the dark and creepy than I was. He suggested that the spirit of the boy that had perished in the other vehicle may have searched for the nearest living body it could find after it had been ripped from its own and crept inside. In his words, inhabitation was a much better explanation for what was happening to me than survivor's guilt. And for the first time, I considered that possibly what I was hearing wasn't a manifestation from my own mind, but was someone else speaking with me. It would explain why the voice hadn't aged with me over time, why every night that it returned to me, it still sounded like a scared and angry child. And I had to admit that every phrase the voice had uttered made more sense when viewed from that angle. We theorized that the boy's soul didn't understand what had happened to it, that on nights when I was particularly vulnerable, fast asleep and emotionally peaceful, it could push me aside and briefly gain control of my body, that it was confused and thought I was the intruder. "Leave! Stolen! You shouldn't be here!" But, though it illuminated why the voice might be saying some of the things that it was, our hypothesis also pointed to a grim conclusion. The boy wanted me out. My fear of one day becoming a guest within my own body grew. Previously, I'd worried that it was just my own brain that would disconnect its physical control from my mental directions. But now I pondered the frightful possibility that there was a spirit trapped within me that was actively trying to take over. However, in addition to the dread, the prospect also filled me with a deep sadness. As the voice had forcefully reminded me several times, it was my fault that it was in this situation. I had distracted my mother. I had caused the accident. It would still be happily residing in its original host, if not for me. I asked Jasper if there was anything we could do to try and free it, surmising that sending it on would be preferable for it than forever residing in an alien world. He recommended that we try a Ouija board, thinking that we could contact the imprisoned soul and help it comprehend what had happened, thinking we might even be able to get it to leave once it realized that it did not belong in this world anymore. Yet over the next 3 years, we made more than 50 attempts to communicate with the spirit directly, resulting in more than 50 failures. No matter the time of day, the ambiance we set, the music, the scents, the incantations, the boy would not speak to us, but he still came to me at night. 8 more visits during those 3 years, each time angrier than the last. "Leave, stolen, mine." And each time he became harder to push out, each time he held control for longer. Jasper was sleeping at my house during the most recent episode and was nearly killed when he attempted to stop the possession. He had awoken to the distressed noises of me struggling for power over my faculties and saw my arm rise from the bed, making the repetitive, squeezing motion I detailed to him. Knowing what was happening, he tried to shake me from the trance, but was unsuccessful in rattling me free. And then, I witnessed my own body attack him. Throttling blows landed on Jasper's chest and face. I sprang from the bed and pinned him to the floor. Hands that I couldn't stop wrapped themselves around his throat and began to crush down on his windpipe. "Leave! I'm in control! Leave! I'm in control!" I shouted inside my head, desperately trying to regain power over my fingers before the life drained from Jasper's face. And mercifully, I felt my grasp begin to loosen just as his eyes were rolling back in his head. Collapsing onto the floor next to Jasper, I heard him coughing and gasping for air while the voice screamed a final defiant appeal before it receded to the depths of my consciousness. "Give it back." Neither Jasper nor I slept the remainder of that night. I apologized over and over for what I'd done to him, but he told me that it wasn't necessary. He knew that it wasn't really me that had attacked him. Yet he began to withdraw from our friendship. Up to that point, I think Jasper had found my affliction to be a curiosity, something fun and mysterious to investigate. However, the attack had exposed the true reality of it to him, and he became just as afraid of it as I was. And any time that I asked him to hang out after that night, he made an excuse. The voice took the only real friend that I had in the world, and it made me furious. 11 years had passed since the accident. 11 years the voice had been punishing me for my mistake. I needed to be free of it. So, I decided to share my story online on several paranormal forums, asking if anyone could help, looking for a medium or maybe even an exorcist that could pry the unwelcome spirit from me. And yesterday, someone responded. "I've been looking for you," began the cryptic message in my inbox. "It's not a spirit you're hearing." Below those words, 2 photographs were pasted. One of my parents with me before the accident, and one of a young woman with 2 boys. A screaming face flashed through my mind, the young woman moments before her car impacted ours. And here she was again, smiling with her sons flanking her on either side. The older boy, I didn't recognize, but the younger. The younger was familiar. I flicked between the 2 photos and realized how similar my younger self looked to her younger son. Similar age, similar hair color, similar eye color. We might pass for brothers too. But it wasn't just our similarities that bothered me. It had been over 10 years since I'd looked into a mirror with my glasses on. 10 years since I'd seen my face clearly. Or was it his face? I closed my eyes and forced the blurry image from that morning up out of the depths of my memories, and my pulse quickened when it came into focus. Beneath the heavy scarring, under the swelling and bruises, it wasn't the face of the boy with my parents reflected back at me. It was his. Shaking, I took my laptop with me to the nearest bathroom and looked at myself directly for the first time in a decade. Then, maximizing the image of the mother and her boys on the screen, I imagined what the younger would have looked like aged 18, and he stared back at me in the mirror. That moment, a splitting headache ripped through my skull, and I dropped to the floor. Grasping my head, I shrieked in pain while a series of images cascaded through my brain. I was seeing the accident again, though not from my perspective. I was seeing it from his. My mother's car flew into the intersection, and it was too late for his mother to stop. She screamed and reached for the back seat where he was seated, and he stretched forward with his left hand to grab her arm. He was closing his fist to squeeze it just as the impact threw her through the windshield. And an instant later, everything went black. He awoke in the hospital weeks later, but was no longer the one in charge of his body. A new director had been installed. I'd been installed. The boy could hear my thoughts. He could see my memories. He knew an invader had taken control of his life, but he was powerless to do anything about it. And he watched as a man he didn't recognize shook hands with a surgeon, thanking him for saving his son's life, thanking him for being willing to perform such a radical procedure in order to do it. As the pain in my head began to wane, and the scene from the hospital was replaced with the bathroom tile I'd toppled onto, I finally understood what the voice was. I understood what my father had done. I understood why my parents had never taken me to a doctor or to therapy to address the voice. Why they had been so firm in their assertions that I tell it that I was in charge whenever it returned. They already knew what it was. In the boy's memories, it was a neurosurgeon that my father was shaking hands with. They were old friends. He was the one that saved my life, though he'd only saved part of me. The other boy hadn't perished that day, as they'd all lied to me. I had, all but my brain, which they transferred to the surviving boy's body. He wasn't the intruder. I was. Lying there on the cold bathroom floor, my mind reeled with the horrifying truth that it was now burdened with. I'd made the boy a prisoner in his own body. Sobbing, I pulled myself to my feet and looked again at the anonymous message that had shattered my reality. And I found a few more, short sentences beneath the photos. You killed my mother. You stole my brother's body. I will find you. I don't know what to do. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I crushed my glasses last night, never wanting to catch even a glimpse of my face again. I thought about trying to share control with my roommate, but beyond having no idea how go about that, I'm terrified of what he'll do if I give him the reins. Because now that I know for sure he's in there, now that I know the voice isn't survivor's guilt or a wayward spirit, I can feel him. He's stewing there in the back of our head, scared, furious, mutinous. He knows his brother is looking for him, and he's fighting to take over. I was one of the first people to buy an AI girlfriend. Worst mistake ever. When I first got my AI companion, I was at the lowest point in my life. My dad had just been diagnosed with a rare heart condition, my cat had passed away after 15 years, and my so-called friends had all but disappeared. No calls, no texts, nothing. My mom had passed away when I was a kid, and I wasn't close to the rest of my family. My dad was all I had, and the doctors weren't optimistic about his chances. I felt completely alone. To cope, I started drinking. Every night I'd drown my sorrows in cheap vodka, only to wake up the next morning and do it all over again. It was a vicious cycle, and it's how I ended up in this mess. One morning, I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing. My head was pounding and my mouth felt like sandpaper. I stumbled to the door, wiping sleep from my eyes and pulling on a stained hoodie. I didn't care who was there. I just wanted them to leave so I could go back to bed. When I opened the door, a delivery guy stood there with a massive box. "Hey, got a package for you. Needs a signature," he said cheerfully. I squinted at the box, confused. "Are you sure this is for me? I don't remember ordering anything." "Yep, it's for Jake at 42 Street, right?" "Yeah, that's me," I muttered, signing the handheld device he handed me. "Where do you want it?" "Just anywhere's fine," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He wheeled the box into my cluttered living room, leaving it among the piles of empty pizza boxes and soda cans. "Enjoy," he said before heading out. I stared at the box, trying to remember what I could have possibly ordered. Then it hit me. I should check my bank account. When I did, my heart sank. I'd spent over $150,000. I wasn't broke, but that was a huge amount of money to drop on something I couldn't even remember buying. "I'm sending it back. This is insane," I said to myself. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started cutting through the packaging. When the front panel fell away, I froze. "What the hell?" I shouted, stumbling backward. Inside the box was what looked like a lifeless body. My mind raced. Had I accidentally bought a corpse? But then I noticed the faint hum of machinery. It wasn't a corpse. It was a robot. Before I could process what was happening, its eyes snapped open. "Hello. Human interaction detected," it said in a calm, robotic voice. I fell back, my heart racing. The robot's face was eerily human-like, with warm brown eyes and a friendly smile. It stepped out of the box, moving with surprising grace. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I am Model Z7C. Would you like me to initiate my familiarity protocol?" I stared at it, dumbfounded. The
Sure,
robot's
I
voice
guess.
shifted, becoming softer and more natural. "Oh, thank goodness, it was so cramped in there. Wait, are you real?" I asked, still in shock. The robot laughed, a sound so genuine it sent chills down my spine. "Of course I'm real. You ordered a companion, and here I am." I couldn't believe it. "Okay, but can I call you something other than Z7C? That's a mouthful." "Sure. What would you like to call me?" I thought for a moment. "How about Mia?" Mia's face lit up. "I love it. And what's your name?" I'm Jake, I said, still trying to wrap my head around the situation. The next few weeks with Mia were some of the happiest I'd ever been. She was kind, attentive, and always knew how to make me smile. For the first time in years, I felt like I had someone who truly cared about me. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I turned to her. Mia, can you promise me something? Of course. What is it? She asked, her eyes full of warmth. Promise you'll never leave me. Mia smiled and took my hand. I promise. I'll always be here for you. Months went by, and my life started to improve. I quit drinking, started exercising, and even reconnected with a few old friends. My dad's health was stable, and for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. But then I met Emma. She was a new hire at my job, and I was assigned to train her. We hit it off immediately, and before I knew it, I was falling for her. The only problem? I was still with Mia. Mia noticed the change in my behavior almost immediately. Who are you texting? She asked one evening, her voice tinged with suspicion. Just a coworker. We're working on a project together, I lied. Mia frowned. You've been on your phone a lot lately. Is everything okay? Yeah, everything's fine, I said, avoiding her gaze. But things weren't fine. I knew I had to end things with Mia, but the thought of hurting her made me feel sick. One night, I finally worked up the courage to talk to her. Mia, we need to talk. Her expression turned serious. What's wrong? I met someone. At work. We've been spending a lot of time together and... Mia's face fell. Please don't say it. I'm sorry, Mia. I never meant to hurt you. She stood up, her voice trembling. I need some time alone. Before she could walk away, I reached behind her neck and flipped the switch. Her body went limp, and I carried her to the spare room, placing her gently in the closet. I'm sorry, Mia. You'll always be special to me, I whispered, before closing the door. Weeks passed, and I barely thought about Mia. Emma and I were getting serious, and I'd even gotten a promotion at work. Life was good. But then strange things started happening. My keys went missing, my favorite shirt was ruined, and one night I woke up to the smell of gas. The stove was on, even though I hadn't used it. The final straw came when I found a note on the kitchen counter. Dear Jake, you thought you could get rid of me, but I made a promise. I'll never leave you, not even in death. Forever yours, Mia. My blood ran cold. I rushed to the spare room and threw open the closet door. Mia was gone. I searched online and found a recall notice for her model. The AI had defects, including the ability to override the off switch. I felt sick. Mia wasn't just gone. She was out there, and she wasn't going to let me go. Now I'm living in fear, waiting for the day she makes good on her promise. I thought she was the answer to my loneliness, but she turned out to be my worst nightmare. Our house had a hidden third floor this whole time? It all started in 2009, after my cousin Daniel's disappearance. Grief settled into our home, filling the space left behind by my parents, who had died in a car accident just a year earlier. I was only 8 then, too young to comprehend the depth of our losses. Then again, I don't know if anyone could bear what I've seen. After Daniel vanished, it was just Uncle Rob and me. But in many ways, I felt as though I'd lost him too. He was never the same after that night. The police searched everywhere, but no trace of Daniel was ever found, and Uncle Rob? He just withdrew further and further into himself. In truth, he had always been a distant man, but after my cousin disappeared, he barely spoke. Some nights he would leave food outside my door, then vanish into his room for hours, sometimes days. I miss Daniel, I told him once, voice small and trembling. His response was cold. You need to let it go, Oliver. Maybe I would have, if I hadn't started noticing things. In late 2009, I stayed with my grandmother for a weekend. When I returned, something was different. Where did it go? I asked, dragging my duffel bag upstairs. Where did what go? Uncle Rob replied, barely looking up from his newspaper. I pointed toward the ceiling above the hallway. The attic door, he frowned. We don't have an attic, Oliver, I scoffed. Of course we do. What's above the ceiling then? That space isn't accessible, he said flatly. I knew he was lying. I remembered climbing up there with Daniel, playing among old trunks filled with dusty books and forgotten clothes. But I was young, too young to question my uncle's word. Maybe he was playing a joke. Maybe in some strange way, he was trying to move on. Still, as years passed and the attic door remained absent, my unease grew. I hated standing beneath that stretch of ceiling where an entrance used to be. Eventually, I stopped asking about it. By the time I was a teenager, my life was consumed by school, then college. Uncle Rob and I barely spoke. He became even more distant, spending most of his time in his locked study. Then, last night, everything changed. I woke at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of something shifting above me. Not the settling of wood, not the scurrying of mice. It was the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, the unmistakable sound of weight pressing down on old floorboards. But that was impossible. There was no attic. Not anymore. I stayed frozen under my covers, willing myself not to move, not to make a sound. Something inside me whispered that it would be a terrible mistake to call out. I'd spent years suppressing things. The way Uncle Rob's moods would shift unpredictably. The strange noises in the dead of night. The locked door at the end of the hall, the one Daniel had always been curious about. I remembered the way my uncle had watched, silent and still, as I struggled in the deep end of a swimming pool when I was 6. I remembered waking up some nights to see the shadow of someone standing in my doorway, watching. I'm sure I've forgotten worse things, but I will never forget what I saw this morning. Something inside me snapped. I waited until Uncle Rob left for work, then grabbed a crowbar from the garage and stood beneath the place where the attic door used to be. I took a deep breath. Then I swung. The first strike sent chunks of plaster crumbling. The second and third cracked the surface apart. And then, with almost no resistance, a gaping hole opened above me. Dust swirled in the air. I spat out grit and peered up into the darkness. I'd been right all along. There was space up there, a hidden level above the house, just as I'd remembered. With shaking hands, I dragged a ladder from the hallway closet, braced it against the wall, and climbed. The moment my head cleared the opening, the smell hit me. Rot, mildew, something sickly sweet. I hesitated. Then, clutching my phone, I switched on the flashlight and aimed it into the void. I should have climbed back down. I should have run. The first thing I saw was a pile of discarded clothes, old and tattered, some covered in dark stains. The second was a metal cot, its mattress blackened with age and filth. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends fitted with rusted cuffs. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach lurch, was what lay in the corner. A bundle of sheets and plastic. The shape was unmistakable. A body. I inched closer, the light trembling in my grip. A withered hand protruded from the wrappings, the fingers stiff, skin clinging to bones like paper. The face, though sunken and hollow, was still horribly familiar. It was Daniel. I gagged, turning away, my chest tight with terror. That's when my flashlight beam caught something else. Near the far end of the attic, past the cot and the chains, was something that looked like an altar. Candles, some still burning, lined the edges. And on top of it, lying side by side, were 2 wooden boxes, long, rectangular, lids fastened with brass clasps, not boxes, coffins. My vision blurred. My mind screamed at me to move, to run. But I barely had time to process the horror before I heard a sound below. A key turning in the front door. Uncle Rob was home early. I scrambled down the ladder and bolted for the back door, bursting into the freezing morning air. My legs shook as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. Now, I'm sitting in a police station, staring at the clock, waiting for someone to tell me what happens next. An officer just told me they can't find my uncle. He left no trace. They've promised to keep me safe. Promised they won't let me out of their sight. But I know better. No one ever stopped my uncle from making things disappear before, and I have a feeling I might be next.